Well, welcome everyone to the Atheist and Christian Book Club. We are a monthly get-together of both skeptics and believers, respectfully discussing important books from both perspectives. My name is James Walker, and I am the president of Watchman Fellowship, in addition to being the co-founder of the Atheist and Christian Book Club. Watchman Fellowship is a Christian apologetics ministry focusing primarily on interfaith evangelism. So we deal a lot in the area of cults and new religious movements, the occult. But we also have an interest in atheism. Thus, we have the club and want to welcome everybody to it. Our guest author is going to be running a little late. He had an emergency at school, but he
He's
is
here.
expected to join
He's
us.
here.
Oh, he's here now.
He
Great.
just made it.
That's great. I wanted to at least take a few minutes before I introduce our special guest to talk about the next club and take care of some housekeeping on that. So our other co-founder is Bill Cluck, as most of you know. We've been doing this now for 6 years. This is our 6th year that we're in right now. And some of the insiders know about what's been going on with Bill, but I'm going to go ahead with his permission and talk about to the rest of the club and introduce why we're going to have a very special one-of-a-kind book club next month in October. So the reason is Bill has a little bit off and on, but especially here in the last maybe 5 or 6 months here in 2024 has been going through some real struggles with the club and with the whole issue of atheism and Christianity. And he has what he's called an existential crisis of faith, or maybe in his case, crisis of lack of faith. So he's been dealing with this off and on. So outside of the club, we helped put together a special meeting with Bill, about a 1 hour private Zoom meeting with Luke Barnes. Luke Barnes was one of our authors maybe 2 years ago or 3 years ago, a Christian author who, a cosmologist, or is he an astrophysicist, I think? Um,
Both.
Yes, but he wrote a book on the fine tuning, one of the fine tuning books, and that has greatly affected Bill. He can tell us more about it later in this club. But bottom line is, we're going to have our next October book club is going to be all about Bill. It's an atheist fine-tuned crisis of faith. And so we're not going to have a book. Bill is going to be our book topic, and we're going to talk with Bill, both sides. So he's compared his crisis that he's been going through with uh, putting things on the shelf. So, Bill, how do you deal with that? Well, that one, he says, I just put it on the shelf. And what can happen with putting things on your shelf is the weight can be overwhelming and your shelf can
Fine, I
eventually.
read this
Yeah.
book. Okay.
Yes, and he does deal with that. So Graham, hold on, because we want you to help him get started even before next month on this. So either do we want to from an atheist position, we want our atheist to help him prop up that shelf and strengthen that shelf a little bit more. And from the Christian position, from my position, I'm wanting to put some more weight up there and help it come down the rest of the way. So but to that private meeting or Zoom meeting with the Australian Luke Barnes, that both Bill has volunteered to let that go public now. So what we're going to do is we're going to deal with Bill and have a whole book club just about Bill's struggles, and that's going to be October 3rd at 7 o'clock Central Time. And so to get ready for that, we're going to have a watch party over at my house to watch the video with Luke Barnes. And so the private video with Luke and with Bill, and with Bill's permission to do that. So if you want to come over to my house, if you live in North Texas and want to do that, it's going to be September 17th, which is Tuesday from 7 to 9. And we'll have some refreshments and just have a get together at my house. We'll watch that discussion, and this will bring us kind of up to speed on what's been bothering Bill the most, and what Luke was sharing with him on that. And then we will have that watch party at my house, and then we'll follow that with the book club itself. So I don't know if I've lost you, if that makes sense, what I've shared so far, but anyway, I really appreciate Bill's transparency and his authentically sharing the struggles he's going through. And
Well,
again, maybe
I went and texted Ken Daniels, who will be on later, and said I'm having a crisis of faith. And Ken did say he'd pray for me. So
Oh, okay. Well, I doubt he really said that, Bill, but I'm sure he cares
I
about you. And he
doubt.
is your friend and would
Believe.
want to help you make the right decision. And we all want to make the right decision.
Sure.
And I know if I was in Bill's shoes right now, that Bill would be trying to get me help from both sides and
Sure. Absolutely.
to make the right decision. I think what book club's all about. It's in fact, in Graham's book, I think he talked about never seeing or rarely seeing somebody make a transition from one side to the other. And that hasn't happened in this case either. But, we on both sides, I think we've seen movement in our book club over these last now 6 years that we've been doing it. So anyway, if you watch on our Friends of the Atheist and Christian Book Club, you'll see the announcement. We'll also post the video with Luke Barnes and Bill Cluck. We'll post that for everybody to see after the watch party. So if you can't be at my home, you can still watch that video. But let me go ahead and get to this month's club and our special guest, Graham Oppy. Graham, is great to have you back with us. Graham is an Australian philosopher whose main area of expertise is in the area of philosophy of religion. He currently holds the post of professor of philosophy and associate dean of research at Monash University and serves as CEO of the Australasian Association of Philosophy. He's also on the editorial boards of Philo, Philosopher's Compass, Religious Studies, and Sophia. He was also elected Fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities in 2009. Now, he's a returning guest with us on the club. He's having discussed his book. Last year, he discussed his book, Atheism, The Basics, last year. And then, as well as earlier, he discussed Four Views on Christianity and Philosophy when he was joined by his Christian co-author, Timothy McGrew. That's, I think, back in 2001. So Graham deconverted from Christianity to atheism as a teen, and he's the author of numerous other books, including this month's book, Conversations About God and the Problem of Evil. Graham, welcome back to the Atheist and Christian Book Club.
Oh, thanks for inviting me back. I enjoyed the last two times. I'm sure I'll enjoy this one as well.
Well, you've been one of our favorite guests, and I appreciate you taking your time coming all the way from Australia with us by Zoom. And I heard that you had somewhat of maybe a little emergency there at your school this morning.
Yes, so it was an emergency school meeting about a budget crisis, which is
Well, that's the worst
my
kind
head,
of emergency, isn't it?
my head is full of stuff that I want to get out of my head immediately. I'm afraid.
Oh, yes, that's I don't love those kind of meetings either. It's never good news when they have a budget meeting, right? It's just like an emergency
No.
bad news usually. It
Is
seems like.
that is that evidence, solid evidence for the problem of evil is university budget meetings?
In case we needed more proof that evil exists, right?
Budgetary constraints.
Yes. Bill, did you want to start off with a question? Usually, you and I, as club founders, will start off the questioning. And those who are observing, those who are club members, if you have a question at any point, if you'll text it in, then Daniel Ray or Brady Blevins will get that question and call on you to unmute your mic and come on up. But we want to give maybe Bill a chance, and that did come up in the book, by the way, Bill. I don't know if you remember reading that, but he had a
Yeah, I
section
read the whole
on
thing.
the problem of evil. And so did
Well, as
you?
you know, James, I just go with what the Bible says. So I'd like to read some scripture if you don't mind. So if you turn into your Bibles to Psalm 73, David says, but as for me, my feet had almost stumbled, my steps had nearly slipped. For I was envious of the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. For they have no pangs until death. Their bodies are fat and sleek. They are not troubled, and so forth. But then he goes later in the psalm and he says, but when I thought how to understand this, it seemed for me a wearisome task until I went into the sanctuary of God. Then I discovered their end. Truly, you set them on slippery places, you make them fall to rain. So what David's saying is when you get an eternal perspective and see that time is just this very momentary thing, and I think you all discussed this in the book, about how temporary time can be. And I think one of the authors said, but when you look at the big picture from eternity, it would seem to be just nothing. So how do you feel about that, Fran? That's to be the
okay, so I think it depends a lot on what you think the big picture looks like. So if you have a kind of naturalistic perspective and you think, well, we get 70 years, or maybe it's a bit more now on average, but that's what you get. It all matters, right? And it matters in the following way, that whatever you do now will always be what you did now, right? So whenever you're acting, you should think seriously about what you're doing, because it's a permanent kind of bit of the reality that there is, and in my view, all of the reality that there is. It may be different if you have a perspective where you think, well, there's eternity, and in fact, this life is just a kind of insignificant fragment in the full life that you're going to have. I'm making some assumptions about universalism, or at least, everybody lives forever. That some people it's bad and some people it's good, whatever, right? From that kind of perspective, what you do now may seem completely insignificant, but that's not the way that's not my perspective. From my perspective, it matters. Every decision that you make is important, because that's it, right? That's all there is. But for you, there's that series of decisions and the consequences that come after.
Yeah, it's frustrating as an atheist to existentially, things you do in life, whether, like, I won the state championship in racquetball when I was 30. Okay. Now everybody's gone. Nobody cares. I come to Dallas and all they want to talk about is Calvinism, and they could care less about anything I've done. So from your point of view, as a person, existentially, how do you find meaning in life?
So I think the part of what gave meaning to your life, I'm assuming that it mattered to you that you won the racquetball.
It did to me, nobody else.
Right, but that doesn't go away. It still matters to you. It's an important thing that you did. It's an important part of your life. It's much better that you feel that way about it than that you think, oh, geez, I wasted my time doing all that racquetball back then, right? Because the perspective is, there's you and there's all these other people, and we live in this universe, and the universe is what there is. The things that matter, what's the value of your life is just the sum of the various things that you do, what you make of it. And it actually matters what you make of your life. Some people make a terrible mess of their lives, and that's terrible for them.
Okay, in your book, page 23, you talk about one would only go for the view if you could accept the view that the transition is indeterministic, and you talk about quantum mechanics and so forth, that the universe, and you're right, it does seem to be indeterministic at a quantum level, Schrodinger's cat or whatever. And we don't have a unified theory. We have the standard model of particle physics, which does not calibrate with the general theory of relativity, the big picture. But have you read Luke Barnes' book, Fortunate Universe?
I haven't read it. No, I had an interesting conversation online with Luke somewhere. I don't remember where it was. And it's on along with thousands of other books, it's on my to-do list. I hope to get to it eventually.
Well, we
Yeah.
had it in the book club, and you say you read it, so I briefly read it, but then I started reading it when I was waiting for Teresa, and I had 15 minutes to kill, and then I had another 15 minutes. And when I really got into it, I went, whoa, so many things have to go right. I mean, right from the four forces of nature, the strong and weak nuclear force, the gravitational force, and the electromagnetic force. You could kind of see at the beginning of the universe how positive, negative charges might form, attract each other. But how would you explain the strong nuclear force, where at the atomic level, you have these quarks that are positive that that have this force that binds them together? Where in the world would that force come from? Does that make sense?
So I guess the way that I want to think about this is just to think about from a fairly abstract but big perspective. So think about there being a causal reality, right? And think about it as having various features. And think about how we're going to explain the existence of this thing and its features, right? So in the end, there's really two options. It doesn't have an explanation, or there's an explanation, and the only explanation that there can be is some kind of necessity. Things had to be that way, right? The doesn't have an explanation is it's right. There's no explaining why it exists rather than not. There's no explaining why it's this way rather than some other way. It just happened that way. And the alternative is to say, well, no, at least in some respects, things just had to be that way, even if you can't really understand how that could be necessary. So from a theistic perspective, the way to think about this is you think that God's necessary. And you think maybe that some of the things that feed into creation are necessary. God couldn't have done it a different way. There are other things on this picture that aren't necessary, which you will explain ultimately by saying that that's just the way that God turned out to be. It just happened that God had this particular plan, but he could have had a different plan because he could have made different universes. Why did he have this one rather than another one? Well, there's no explaining that now, right? We've just got this kind of brute difference between the worlds. So some things are necessary, some things don't have explanation. You can kind of tune the picture to have more or less things be necessary. Like if you're Spinoza and if you think of Spinoza as a theist, everything turns out to be necessary. But that's not the view that most people favor. Most people want to have some stuff that's just the way it was, no explanation. Now, if you're a naturalist, you have the same thing. It's just that you're working with the initial state of the causal reality and features of the causal reality, and you can have the view that although it looks as though although it would be nice to have more that isn't explained this way, some stuff is just necessary. The rest of it just doesn't have an explanation. It's the same combination of things that you get on the theistic picture. And the important question, because you're asking about fine-tuning, is going to be this. Supposing that the universe is fine-tuned, where does the fine-tuning happen? That is, where's it fixed that the universe is fine-tuned? Is it right at the beginning, or is there some chance thing that happens later that brings about the fine-tuning? If it's later and it's chance, then that's the explanation, right? So it doesn't matter how improbable it is, right? Once you've agreed that chance is operating, it doesn't matter what the range of possibilities are. Imagine, the universe is crammed with civilizations and we run a galactic lottery and there's a zillion tickets in the lottery and one of them gets drawn. Assuming that there's no cheating, it's just a matter of chance that improbable event, one in a zillion, that this ticket would get pulled out, but it happened. The other option is it's been fixed from the very beginning. But then the right thing to say about that is that it's just necessary. it seems to me. I think that you should think of all of the features that are baked in at the very beginning as necessary, just as a theist will think that there's all this stuff that's just baked into God, right? It's necessary that God's omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good, a whole lot of stuff like that, various properties. And there's no explaining then why God has those properties. That's just where you begin. So my thought, the way that I'm thinking about this is you're going to end up saying exactly the same thing on the theistic picture. Either it was just baked into God that God was going to make a fine-tuned universe, and in particular this one, and that's what explains the fine-tuning, or it wasn't baked in, and there was some subsequent transition when God decided to make this universe. But there's all these other decisions that God could have made. Presumably God could have made a very different kind of universe without the fine-tuning in it, right? And then ultimately it's an accident, right? It's just it's just the way things turned out. And there's no explanation. Does that make sense? That's the way I think about it.
Oh, sure. It's just one improbability. The gravitational constant 10 to the 40th. Even atheist Sean, what's his name, said, Sean Carroll, that we didn't expect the cosmological constant to be 10 to the 120th. So ridiculously improbable. And just the reality of billions of galaxies with billions of stars, all that mass, and then has to be in equilibrium with the dark energy expanding the universe, that equilibrium between gravity of these masses, these millions of masses, and the dark energy. It just, how many improbabilities are we going to have before we give up?
And what's the size of the total improbability? Well, I think it doesn't matter. It depends what you think about the future of physics a little bit here too, because currently in physics, there's all these values that you write into the theories by hand, and they look massively improbable. But the future of physics may remove lots of that stuff, right? This is something that we just don't know. So that's one issue about whether we're really committed to the improbabilities or whether it's merely seems to us at the moment, but it will later turn out not to be the case that we're committed to them. But that's not really the kind of main issue. The main issue is about ultimately whether you think that the improbabilities are going to be in the theory no matter what, unless you insist that the things that look improbable actually for reasons of where they occurred were necessary instead.
Okay, on page 70, one of the authors, Sam, talks about open theism. So, I think as atheists, we underestimate the sovereignty of God, that we tend to look at things from our point of view instead of God's point of view. So in Calvinism, God is deterministic. He decrees all things, and you really don't have much of a say in it. But if you're an open theist, it carves out a little space for human freedom and so forth, and maybe we can impact the future or whatever. So, and can you explain the difference between open theism and middle knowledge?
Okay, so now you're asking me, now you're asking me for a lot. Okay, so the way that the open theist thinks about things, I think, is that there's genuine indeterminism in the world, and ahead of time, nobody can know, not even an omniscient being can know ahead of time how indeterministic things are going to turn out. So so for somebody like Hartshorne, right, it's logically impossible for God to know the future. Right, there's genuine indeterminism in the world, and God just can't know ahead of time how it's going to turn out. So for Hartshorne, God kind of evolves with the universe. It's a very different picture from, say, the Calvinist picture where, or maybe before I go there, I'll go to a different picture, a more, maybe say a more Thomistic picture where God knows how everything's going to turn out from the moment of creation. There's no inputs that God receives about anything. God knows all the details from the beginning. God's creative act might be, you might understand, because it's a kind of single eternal act from the Thomistic perspective, might somehow be tuned to the world somehow, but still God knows just through the act everything, right? Middle knowledge. So Monash says we distinguish between, I don't know what the right terminology is, but different aspects of God's knowledge at the kind of point of creation. So there's some stuff that God knows prior. So this is kind of before God wills to have a particular world, this pre-volitional knowledge that God has. God knows what all possible creatures would do in any possible circumstances in which he placed them. In particular, he knows what any creatures like us would freely do in any circumstances in which we were placed. And then God then just considers all the worlds that he can make, given this knowledge about what all the creatures are going to do, picks the best world out of those and makes it, knowing in advance what everybody's going to freely do. And in this case, there's no indeterminism. At the moment that God acts, everything is fixed, so it's deterministic. But nonetheless, according to Molina, there's freedom, because what God had knowledge of is what the creatures would freely choose to do in the various circumstances. So God makes this world, comes to a certain point where you have a choice to make, you make it freely, even though God knew from all eternity that you were going to make that choice. And in fact, chose the world partly because you were going to make that choice at this point in time. That's my understanding of the Molinist perspective.
So is it possible, I think part of the book says God might be, as Richard Dawkins said, this infanticidal, genocidal, homophobic, misogynistic, just a badass God. So could that explain the problem of evil, that God just has a badass side,
So I think that putting it that way is not really the most fruitful way to put it. You might, right? You might think, if you're a kind of traditional theist, right, you're going to think that God's good. That's just part of God's nature, right? So what Dawkins is really thinking about is, let's suppose that there's no God, but suppose that there's something else that we put in God's place in our picture. So it's not that we're naturalists and we think there's nothing there. We think that perhaps there's something there that's an indifferent being. It's not right to call it God with a capital G. It's a kind of God with a small g, let's say. Or you might think there's a thing there that's actually, as you said, a real badass, right? That's something that you might think. I mean, that view has no advantages over I think, over the kind of perfectly good God. It faces a problem of good that's just as serious as the problem of evil, and right, it would be I think it would be really weird if you weren't prepared to accept the kind of traditional view about a good God to go to a kind of bad God. But an indifferent God has more potential, right? The kind of God that maybe sets up the universe and just lets it run, because what this God likes doing is making universes, and it doesn't really care how they turn out. So it just keeps making one after another. Where in one of them, our one, we're perhaps mildly unlucky. It's got some pretty bad evils in it, right? So you could have that kind of view. But as I said at the beginning, I don't think that you should think that here we're kind of speculating about whether, for example, the Christian God might be evil, or the Islamic God might be evil, or the Jewish God might be evil, right? Just kind of by stipulation, we're supposed to not think those things, right? Christians believe in a perfectly good God.
All right, well, thanks for trying to salvage my faith. I appreciate it. But I see a million questions from Ken and Phil and James. So thanks.
I don't know if we have any. Let me go ahead and had some questions for you there, Graham. In past discussions in our book club, we've run into questions about defining evil. And let me say, the problem of evil to me is if Bill says the number one problem atheists has is fine tuning, I would say the number one problem Christians have would be this problem of evil or problem of suffering. And that part of the terminology might be an issue because it comes up from time to time. Evil, the term evil can imply like a moral, an objective morality. So God could be good, but he seems to be evil or allow evil, but that has a moral component to it. So you're implying automatically personality or agency or and will, volition, all these things come in when you talk about evil. But it's been suggested several times we need to think of it in terms not of evil and good, but suffering. And so suffering is kind of like electricity. I believe electricity can kill me, but I don't think of electricity as being evil because it's not out to get me. I know that you and Jason in the book discussed briefly in your book. Can you speak to that issue? Is it better to frame it as, instead of evil, as simply suffering?
Or unnecessary suffering.
Or unnecessary suffering?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a bunch of considerations here. I mean, some people think that evil really is just going against the will of God, right? If you go that way, then you're kind of definitionally tying evil to God. Not that I mean that God's evil, but the definition, there wouldn't be any evil if there weren't a God to be able to go against their will. That's obviously not, that needn't be the kind of picture that someone who's not a theist has got about the kind of things in the world that make them think that there isn't a God. I think probably talking about suffering might be better, though it's, I mean, and the question was just brought up about whether we're talking about unnecessary suffering, or maybe what we're talking about really needn't be, I mean, we might draw distinctions. We might say, look, there's a distinction between what used to be the distinction between natural evil and kind of moral evil. So there's suffering that's just due to the outworkings of nature. It's got nothing to do with, let's suppose that humans are the only kind of moral agents
If we
in the universe.
if we say unnecessary evil, are we begging the question?
Yeah, so I'll come back to that. So there's sort of natural evil has just got nothing, is just in the operations of the universe. But moral evil is stuff that humans are responsible for, right? And so there are questions about both, and they're different questions. Why was there animal suffering for, you know, I don't know, a billion years? Why is it? It's not quite that long, half a billion years or something like that. Why has there been animal suffering? There's a question about that. And then there's a question about why humans have been permitted to commit genocides, for example. And lots of people want to distinguish those two questions. And in both cases, you can ask whether there are goods that somehow or other you wouldn't have if you didn't have the suffering. In the case of the animals, it's not clear what those goods would be, but maybe you can tell a story. In the case of the moral evils, say, you know, why was it that people were permitted to why is it that people are allowed to commit genocide? You might think that the best answer that you can give, not all theists go this way, but some theists at least do, is, well, God has some purpose, has some reasons. There are goods that we don't know about that would be lost if humans weren't allowed to do things like commit genocide. Right. There are other stories that you might tell too, but that will do for a kind of first pass on the question.
Ken, did you want to have a redirect on that?
Well, I just had a question back when the topic of necessity and the necessity of the initial state, I think is how you just put it. I'm not sure if I got it right. But I'm not a philosopher, so when I hear the word necessary, my mind always goes to necessary for what? There's a teleology there. And so I just wondering how you would frame that, how you would address that. Are you suggesting that the necessity was towards some end, or is it just was? But how is it? If it just was, it just was. How does that become necessary?
So there's no idea about teleology in this. I think about something like this. It's necessary that 2 and 2 are 4. That's not for anything, right? It's just, it couldn't be anything else. What else could 2 and 2 be other than 4? Right? There's no other way that it could be. In that case, you can think of it as a mathematical necessity. Some philosophers have tried to say that that's a logical necessity, and others have disagreed. A logical necessity would be something like, for anything, it's identical to itself, right? How could that be otherwise? How could something not be identical to itself, right? It has to be everything self-identical. Now, philosophers don't typically think that these are the only classes of necessities. So lots of philosophers have thought, for example, that it's necessary that water is H2O, right? What else could it be? And their answer is there's nothing else that it could be. So there's a necessity. And the kind of necessity that I'm attributing to the initial state of the universe is like that. It's in some sense, which is not easy to explain, philosophers call it metaphysical necessity. There's nothing else that it could be, right? And when you asked, but why say that? Why not just think of it as something that happens and has, that it's a kind of completely unexplained contingency? That's a fair question, right? But this is a question that comes up for theists too. So Richard Swinburne doesn't want to say that God's necessary, right? He doesn't in the sense in which most theists do. He wants to think of it as something rather more like a brute contingency, the existence of God. My own feeling is that it's better to have necessities than brute contingencies. You get a little bit more explanation that way, because if something's necessary, you can explain it. It's necessary, right? Because it had to be, right? But the necessity explains why it happens. But you might think that that's a small advantage, and then it's really not clear what the issue is. So I'm kind of sympathetic to your response. What do you mean it's necessary? But what you're going to be trading it in for is brute contingency. There's just nothing. There's no explanation here, right? And theists typically don't go that way with God. So the naturalist's got no kind of impulse to go that, the other way when it comes to the initial state of causal reality.
Yeah, thank you for that. I don't know if my small mind will ever it will completely follow what all that entails, but I was just having a little chat with Phil in the chat session about this. I posed this question on the sidebar, and he weighed in and finds that not having an explanation seems extremely unscientific. The apple falls from a tree. Well, it just had to be that way, and type of thing. I wonder if you could that.
Right. But at a certain point, you're going to go that way if you're a theist with God. Why does God exist? If you won't accept had to, then you're just going to have to go with, well, happened, right? And this is everybody's problem. Right, that's why I said at the beginning, think about the sum total of everything, right, the causal reality, and then think about what you're going to say about, think of it as the initial part, right? So it doesn't matter whether you think of it as God or something else. You face this challenge about what to say about that initial part, and you can go necessary or you can go just happened, right?
Well,
But it's everybody's problem.
yeah, I'm misunderstanding a little bit too, maybe. Are you trying to say by necessary that it had to be that way? In other words, that
Yes.
the expansion rate was that we looked to be finely tuned. It could have been much greater, much lesser. It just happened to be that way. Or no, it by necessity had to be that way. Which is it?
So
It
it,
just had to be
yeah.
that way, or it's
So
by necessity?
so it depends whether it's fixed at the beginning or not, right? Because if it's not fixed at the beginning, there has to be a transition from not being fixed to fixed. And if that happens somewhere after the beginning, then presumably the only way that you can explain that is that it's an indeterministic transition. Because if it was deterministic, it was already fixed, right? So that's why it matters whether it's initial or not. If it's non-initial, you've just got indeterminism, you've just got chance.
But then
If
chance becomes the improbability problem. What are
right,
the
but
odds?
sure, but it doesn't matter if we agree that it happens somewhere after the beginning. It doesn't matter what the probability is, because that just depends upon how big the range of options are. Let's pretend that they're kind of equally probable. All of the options are equally probable. If it's just indeterministic and we get one of them, that gives us a chance, but it really doesn't matter. The numbers kind of aren't important. If we
Well,
go
so when you say the numbers aren't important, it means as long as you can reduce it to chance, it doesn't matter if it's 1 billion to 1 or 1 trillion to 1.
so,
You have
so,
the chance, so it's okay.
so I'm thinking about it not the way that you just said it. I'm thinking
Okay.
if we agree that it was just a matter of chance, right? And assuming that the fixing of the values happens at a certain point where there's a transition from not fixed to fixed. You've got an indeterministic transition, and there'll be some chance that attaches to it. If we agree that there was an indeterministic transition, it doesn't matter what the chance is, right? We've already agreed that the explanation is the chance has just played out a certain way, right? And so you might think, okay, I don't like this idea that the thing gets kind of fixed by some chance, transition at a later point. But the other option is it's fixed from the beginning, right? It was always fixed that the value is going to be a certain way, right?
Does a theist have to? Is a theist always going to pick one or the other? Because I've
So
seen some
yeah,
like a theistic position that it was all from the Big Bang or whatever the event was, that everything was already laid out exactly what it was going to be, and there's no
right.
supernatural shenanigans is
So
um,
but
involved from that point on.
the theist faces the same question. It's just the question is about the fixing of the values, right? So in the divine mind, are the values fixed from the get-go, or is there some point where, because there's any number of worlds that God could create, presumably God starts off the same in every world, because otherwise you've got unexplained variations in God between the worlds. But in different worlds, God does different things, right? God starts off the same and yet does different things. At some point, there's got to be a transition. That's the only way to explain why you get different worlds, why you get different creations in different possible worlds. So this worry about the fixing of the parameters is exactly the same problem for the theist as it is for the naturalist when it comes to this question about, was it there at the beginning, or does it happen by chance at some later point? Right. That's the kind of core of the line that I'm running. So it's not a question about, from the theist perspective, what things look like from the moment of the within the universe, from the creation of the initial state of the universe. I'm comparing the two views with respect, that is theism and naturalism, with respect to what they say about when exactly the fine-tuning values are fixed to have the values that they do. And if you're Spinoza, you think that from the very beginning, those values were fixed, the way that God was, determined the values of because there's only one possible world that God can make. Everything's necessary, right? The values are fixed from the very beginning. There might be other theistic views on which you also think that much. So you think that the fine-tuning's fixed from the beginning, right? And it just, I mean, maybe Leibniz also was tempted by a view like that. But most people don't think that. Most theists think God could have made any of a huge range of possible worlds, even though, as it were, at the get-go, God's the same in every possible world. Eventually, we get the production of different universes. Something has to change at some point in order to be able to explain why we got this universe in our world, but in some other possible world, they got a different universe. Otherwise, you've just got this kind of brute stuff happening in your worldview, right? And that's no different than it is for the naturalist. As far as
I'm going to
the
have to
problem
call. I'm
goes.
going to have to call defeat on this one because I still can't follow that reasoning. So I'm not gonna. I want to give other people opportunities. I'll go back and watch it again, and I have a cup of coffee that might help. It sometimes helps. So,
But do
we'll
you
do
have a
that.
view on whether, as a non-theist, whether the laws, the fine-tuning was that the laws of nature, such as they are, were baked in from the beginning, or that they kind of froze in place at some point later?
So actually, no, I have no opinion about this. I just think that it's everybody's problem, right? It's the point that I'm making is that the fine-tuning doesn't give you a way of deciding between the naturalist view and the theist view. That's all I wanted to argue on the basis of this. I have no idea, partly because I have no idea what fine-tuning science will eventually commit us to, right? And it's possible that when we have that super theory of quantum gravity, that fine-tuning will have disappeared altogether. I mean, I don't think it's likely, but it's possible. No, I don't have a view about this. I don't see how I possibly could. I don't know enough about the physics or anything else, right? I'm just a philosopher. So definitely not. I don't have a view about where it happened.
So both theistic positions defeat each other. So if you say that God, in a special act from the very initial creation, had everything in place to be exactly what it was like, no chance was involved, it was all then that defeats the Christian worldview or the
No, this doesn't defeat either worldview. It's just the only point that I'm making, if I'm right, is that fine-tuning doesn't favor one view over the other, right? Ultimately, both views face exactly the same, have exactly the same range of options with respect to the fine-tuning and its explanation. That's all that I'm arguing.
Okay, not quite following, but I will go back and watch this again.
So I should say this. So somewhere Luke Barnes wrote some stuff about this where he said that he thought that it's kind of an intriguing suggestion. He doesn't believe it, but he thought it was interesting. It's a kind of, I think that it falls pretty squarely in the domain of something that goes beyond physics, right? I mean, physics doesn't tell you whether God had the fine-tuning in mind from the get-go or not. And physics doesn't tell us, at least not yet, whether the fine-tuning's baked in from the get-go or not, whether there was a kind of phase transition at some point and then the values just fell out of the phase transition, in which case, according to me, clearly there's no need to look for another explanation, no matter how many alternative ways that could have gone. So no matter what the probability is.
Yeah, you're not a fan of multiverse?
So we can take the discussion that we've had so far to be predicated on the assumption that there isn't a multiverse. If there's a multiverse, it doesn't really change things. There'll be a question about whether the multiverse needs fine-tuning at the beginning. And maybe if you're like Klaus Cray and you think that God actually just makes all the possible worlds that are good enough. There's not going to be kind of any interesting question about fine-tuning that differentiates that view from a naturalist who says there's a multiverse that just contains all the possible universes.
So, James, the multiverse doesn't answer any questions, though, right? It just pushes it down the road.
But yeah,
Right.
that's when we had Lawrence Krauss as a guest author, he didn't seem to be much of a fan of it either. It's hard to prove scientifically, obviously, impossible. But also it again, as Graham just said, it implies a finely tuned universe creation mechanism.
So I will say something about what Klaus Cray says. So there's a question about a problem that Bill Rowe introduced about whether God's required to make the best world and what happens if for any world there's a better one. And so Klaus Cray's solution to that is to say, no, God just makes all the worlds that are good enough and that problem goes away. So you could, from his perspective, theists might have a reason to want to believe in a multiverse on those grounds.
Graham, I have a question. If we want to get, maybe this is getting back to the problem of evil. When I started reading the book we had, I was intrigued by your introductory story or analogy of the kingdom and the lampposts. I thought that was really interesting. And I want to run a contingency by you and see what you think about it. You talk about the possibilities of the king who is overseeing, or who maybe knows or doesn't know, or he's somewhat involved, maybe not at all involved. Maybe he's even responsible for the killings. And I had this idea, and I wanted to run it by you, see what you thought. So your prime minister is Albanese. Is that how you pronounce his name?
Yeah, Albanese. Yeah,
Albanese. I knew there was probably something in there. Well, let's say your kingdom is situated in the outback, and now the lampposts with bodies hanging on them would be really weird, wouldn't it? You wouldn't think that was just a brute fact. There would be something worth investigating out there. Why are there lampposts in the outback, and why are there bodies hanging from them? And Albanese knows about this. He's known about it for a long time, and he's like, do something, man. What are you going to do, right? And he disappears. And he's like, well, what's he doing? Nobody's doing anything. Everybody goes out to the outback. Nobody seems to know what's going on here. And the one thing that I thought maybe that your scenario, I don't know if you'd thought about it when you made this, but I was thinking of Christianity immediately. And I don't know if you were thinking of Christianity when you're talking about the kings and the lampposts. But what if somebody went out there and found Albanese himself hanging from a lamppost, and that ended the killings? That the solution was him giving himself to those people who were doing that in order to stop eventually the macabre, gruesome deaths that were going on there. To some degree, I know it's not a perfect analogy, but it seems to me that that's the one that is Christianity, where the God comes in to our world and he's hung from a cross on the road. Have you factored that in? I didn't see it in the book anywhere where I was reading.
Yeah, no. So I hadn't been thinking about that. I mean, the analogy will be imperfect because it'd be kind of weird if Albanese went to the outback and he's being hanged. Suddenly everything was great, because that's not what happened according to the Christian story, right?
No analogy is perfect, right?
Yeah. Right. The world's still full of horrible stuff. So,
and I guess to just clear it up, that what actually ends up happening is the redemption, that death doesn't stop immediately, but that his Albanese's death begins to accomplish something, has accomplished something for the rest of the people in terms of overcoming death eventually. But does that fit in anywhere? The cross, the redemption.
Yep. So it doesn't fit into the story. I mean, the story was just meant to be a kind of initial hook to draw people.
It was a good one. Yeah.
to thinking about things. I didn't think that it was perfect. I mean, after all, the king is just human and has quite limited powers of various kinds, whereas we typically think of God as omnipotent and omniscient and perfectly good. And what won't work for the story but might work for God is just that because God's so completely different from us, there might be goods that God knows about that we don't, or there might be, there's various uncertainties. Whereas for human rulers, it's not plausible to think that, okay, so the ruler's got his reasons. We just don't know what they are. It's perfectly fine that there are bodies hanging from the lampposts. Whereas at least there's amongst philosophical theists, there are quite a few who are prepared to say we don't really know for sure what the goods are that made it permissible for God to allow the Holocaust to happen. We can just be confident that there are some goods. And of course, other people disagree. Other people think that there's stuff about maybe the goods of eternal felicity with God or something like that. And there's some way that the story, those goods somehow or other mean that it's okay for God to allow the Holocaust or whatever. But lots of people don't think they know what the goods are, right? So, I mean, this is just a way of adding to the point about the limitations of the story, really.
Yeah. Yeah. I like what you said. It would be strange for Albanese to go out in the outback. And I think that kind of captures in some sense. I mean, I'm an adult convert, and I wrestled with the strangeness of God in a body coming to us and dying on a cross. What is that? Going out into the wilderness, suffering for the people and all of that kind of thing. Do you find in your dialogue with philosophically minded theists who are Christians, does the cross ever come up? This idea of, I mean, we talk about death and the Holocaust and all of that kind of stuff, but how in your discourse, professionally speaking, with theistic philosophers who are Christians, does the cross ever figure into these contingencies that you guys talk about?
So it does a bit, right? If you go and you look in the standard philosophy of religion journals, there has been a movement in the last couple of decades to not just discuss these very kind of I don't know what's quite the right word. The kind of questions about the existence of God and the attributes of God, and just leave it at that. There's discussion about lots of aspects of, I mean, mostly it's Christian because most of the participants are Christian, but it can also be Islamic or Jewish or other faiths as well. Questions that are more particular. So questions about the resurrection, incarnation, atonement, stuff like that. And so there are discussions of the cross in professional philosophy. They tend not to be so much things where there's an argument between, say, naturalists and Christians, but they tend to be some Christians arguing with other Christians about the interpretation of various aspects of Christian doctrine, but it's definitely there.
Okay. Well, thank you, Graham, for coming on and for answering the question. I like that analogy. I'd never heard it before. It made me think of C.S. Lewis too. So all the lamppost, everything.
Yeah, right.
Triggered my imagination, but thank you. Quick question about the what we were talking about with the necessity argument. Alexander Vilenkin, who's a cosmologist, I don't think he's a theist. I'm not sure which book it appears, but he talks about the idea. I mean, he's not conceding theism in saying this. It's just sort of thinking out loud. But he said that mathematics is the mind is the medium of mathematics, he says. And then he seems to say that the laws of physics as they understand them somewhat have to pre-exist the existence of the universe, that they predate the universe and its origins. And so his postulating thesis is the question is does that mean that there's mind predating the universe? If the laws predate the universe and the laws are mathematical and the mind is the medium of mathematics, does this mean that there was a mind before the beginning, if you want to throw in the before the beginning strangeness? Do you think as a naturalist, is there anything that impresses you with that kind of argument in terms of like, where did the numbers come from? Where did the laws come from? Or
So, okay, so this is slightly complicated because you might think that there's just no ontology for mathematics. 2 and 2 are 4, that's a necessary truth, but there's nothing that makes it true. It doesn't need something to make it true because it couldn't be otherwise. There are philosophers who think that's not right. There must be things, the number 2, the number 4, and so on, abstract objects, and they're what make it true that 2 and 2 are 4. And there's a dispute, which is not a kind of theist versus naturalist dispute, because there are people like Bill Craig who are anti-Platonists, and there are plenty of naturalists who are Platonists, right? So it's a cross-cutting dispute. If you don't think that you need an ontology for mathematics, then you're just going to think, right, we just have these things that are necessarily true, they couldn't be otherwise, and there's no need for anything pre-existing the universe. As soon as there's a universe, these things are just true in it because they couldn't not be true. Right. So that
Okay.
that would be one kind of response. But that was sort of the mathematics part. The laws part, there's a different question. So philosophers, and again, this isn't a kind of naturalist versus theist thing, it's just some philosophers versus others. Some philosophers think that the laws are necessary. Some think that they're contingent. If you think they're necessary, and I'm talking about the laws of nature, then again, you don't need any pre-existence. If you think they're contingent, then so they could have been different. Then it's a different question. As you can probably guess, I kind of lean towards they're necessary. So they just couldn't have been otherwise. That always seems to me to be is for things that are kind of true always everywhere. It tends to be happier to think of them as necessary rather than thinking of them as contingent.
okay.
Let me ask you about the book for a second. First of all, I love the whole concept of the book because I got the book and I'm thinking, wow, I've been introduced to a secret chat with a bunch of philosophy nerds, and it's like you're talking back and forth in a group chat or something. So it was I don't know who thought of the idea, but it was a great idea for making it readable. But could you give us a little bit of background on the co-authors and tell us about Sam and Jason and Mark and how long you've been friends, where are they coming from, theologically or philosophically, and who had the idea to do the book that way?
So, okay, so there is a backstory, and I'm glad you asked because I did want to tell the backstory. So, Jason and Mark are South Africans, and they run a podcast called Brain in a Vat, which is a philosophy podcast, and they discuss all kinds of things on their podcast. And they asked me to come on and talk about God and the problem of evil. And so we had a conversation. It was recorded. It's available as a podcast, I think, or maybe they pulled it down when they decided that they'd do a transcription of the conversation. So this is just a transcription of the first half of it is just a transcript of the conversation that I had with Jason and Mark. And then they thought they had Sam Liebens on. He's a Jewish philosopher. I can't remember which university in Israel he's based at. And Sam, they looked at the content of Sam's podcast. They got a transcript of it as well. And they thought, we can put these together and it'll make a book. And so they did. So that's where the book comes from. I'm not super clear about the contents of what I said because, right, it's just a transcript of something that I talked about a decade ago, something like that. But it was a very nice idea, and they put together a bunch of these books as a based on their podcast. So it's I'm glad that it reads the way it does, because and that it kind of works, because it could have fallen down given that it was just a bunch of us chatting, me chatting to Jason and Mark for my bit. But it worked out.
I thought it was refreshing and easy to read and interesting. I thought it was a great idea of doing a book that way. So, I had a question for you on the on evil. In one sense, evil can be understood as anything that departs from perfection. You talked about that in the book. And so why is that? Why would that be fundamentally problematic for a theistic, like a Christian who believes that God's initial creation was good in God's sight? If it was initially everything was good, is the problem with that? Then how does evil come out of that if it was all good?
Yeah. So the thought. So I've never. I keep coming back and talking about this, but I've never written anything about it. Right. And I don't know whether other people feel the force of this problem. It's not that it seems kind of decisive or particularly a problem or anything. I just find it strange that you could think initially everything was perfect. Everything that there was perfect. And then you get to a subsequent state where that's not true. It's not true that everything is perfect. How can that happen? How can imperfection arise from perfection? That sounds kind of mysterious to me, right? Now, maybe you don't feel.
No, I see. The implication is there had to be a flaw in the perfection, which means it was.
Something like that, right? So how does this work? How do I understand this? Right now, I've never thought of this as a super important question. But I've also never kind of got my head around what I would think of as a satisfying answer to it, right? There, you can try to appeal to things like divine grace, or there are various things, but they still don't help me understand why that would be sufficient to move from the setup where everything's perfect to one where it's not true that everything's perfect. Why would perfection do that unless, as you said, unless it was not perfection?
Yeah, I don't know if any of our other Christians might have some suggestions on that. I mean, we all talk about the fall, and obviously that was in the providence of God all along, but it was still created very good. So I could see how that might be the issue.
Could it be, getting back to the lampposts again, like we've all suffered in our lives, and sometimes when we suffer, we find out, you know the phrase, you find out who your friends really are, right? When you go through bad times. It's kind of a winnowing of our relationships with people, family, friends, whatever. Perhaps it is the case that in God so loving the world that he chose to identify with us at the absolute worst. And I don't know how this doesn't really answer the setup question, but when you look at the extent to which Jesus as a human person suffered with prostitutes, lepers, tax collectors, you name it. I mean, sailors and soldiers and prostitutes and everything. And then he comes in the hymn in Philippians 2, where he empties himself of his divinity. He doesn't, I mean, he's God and man, but that he doesn't use his divinity to his advantage. And he becomes a doulos, a bondservant. So the God of the universe, whose people were enslaved in Egypt, himself becomes a slave in human form and relates to us at our worst, even to the point of death. Now, I don't know how you set up a stage like that. You know, when you're doing a play, if you're like a Shakespeare and you want to have a protagonist as the hero, you go down to, this is something from C.S. Lewis I got, you go down as far deep as you can go so that you can lift everything back up again. And so he comes down to the lowest forms of human suffering himself and suffers to the point of death. I don't know. It doesn't explain why he chose it to do it that way, but it seems like the setup was so that he could do it that way. And as the Bible says, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. I don't know if that's any kind of satisfactory explanation. That's the where I landed. I can't explain, the why did God set it up that way, or that it doesn't really even begin to address perfection and imperfection in a perfect divine being. But ultimately, I think there's a point where everybody, myself at least, I say I don't know, but that's how I reconcile it. I don't know how that speaks to your naturalism or anything, but
Well, yeah. So I don't think it speaks to the question about why there's a move from perfection to imperfection. I mean, it's assuming that we've got to have that move, then the rest of the story you can think of as a way of coping with the imperfection.
yeah.
But why did we? But why did we? What explains the initial movement away from imperfection? Now,
so your objection there,
that's kind of the puzzle.
So what you're saying, if I'm hearing you properly, what you're saying is perfect divine being allows plans, permits, creates plans, or whatever, lets this gear slip and goes from the creation. Would it be possible philosophically or theologically, as you see it, Graham, for a divine being to create something that is less than perfect?
So that's the question. I mean, that's the part of the question that I'm asking, because once you've got a creation that's less than perfect, then if you think of the sum of everything, it's not perfect anymore, right? So we've moved from perfection to imperfection. Now, maybe it's just a mistake in the mathematics. You might say, look, it's better because we always have God, and the other stuff that we add has some value. So there's more value. And so that explains why it's okay, right? Because maybe just because there's more value once you've got the creation, it doesn't matter that some of it's bad and some of it's good. That still doesn't explain why the way I was doing the maths was a wrong thought, though, right? If you've got imperfection, that's just worse than having perfection only, right? As I said, I'm not sold on this thought. I just don't know what to make of it.
Well, I'm reminded of the all of Job's friends. They had all the answers for Job, and then in the end, we find out that they didn't speak rightly of God, and then God puts Job on the stand and asks him a bunch of questions he can't answer, except for he puts his hand to his mouth and repents in sackcloth and ashes. So I think there's probably something there in what we're talking about, where, at least for me, and I will tell you, in Christian apologetics, it's really hard to say I don't know, especially when somebody has a question or they can't think about it. It's really hard. It's the hardest part of my job, to be able to say something like I don't know. I think this is one of those things where it's like, I don't finally know. I think these are good questions. And it's interesting to hear your perspective on that. And I don't know. I think ultimately the kinds of things that we want to know maybe are what's the Ecclesiastes verse? God has put eternity in our hearts, but we aren't going to find out from beginning to end what God has done. So, but thanks, Graham. I appreciate the answer. I'll give up the floor here if somebody else wants to talk.
So, James, I was just wondering, where did you get perfection? Because I don't think it's in the Bible, right?
Right. So, and so that would definitely be a way out. I'm used to talking to people who claim to be perfect being theists, who insist that in the beginning there was just perfection because there was just the perfect being and nothing else. Right. So that's where I get it from. That's where I get it from. You might think that that particular conception's not biblical. You'll get a big argument with them. I mean, it's not my fight now. You'll get a big argument with them about whether it's biblical or not.
Graham, you addressed this in the book too, but could you circle back around and let's talk a little bit about the Alvin Plantinga's free will theodicy and this idea, at least for human evil. Could this be a possible explanation for maybe not all evil, but for a great deal of evil?
So, I mean, just treat it in general terms. It's kind of it's a very great good that humans have free will, and of course, once we've got free will, we can do evil, and at least as things turned out, we ended up doing lots of it, right? And so there's an explanation.
I plan to stop very soon, though.
It's our fault, right? So there's the story. One question, given that God has a choice about how to make us, is whether the goods of freedom are big enough to outweigh the evils, this value of the evils that we do. And after all, humans put other humans in jail to stop them from doing evil. We think that freedom is not that valuable. We're prepared to take it away from people, right, if they're going to act badly enough. So is it just that we disagree with God about the value of freedom, or is it really that actually this story doesn't wash? Freedom isn't sufficiently valuable to justify the Holocaust or whatever. Right. So that's one question for free will defenses.
And you would argue it's not that valuable? So we're going to make you God for a day, and you can fix it how you want it.
So of course I have no idea, right? And I'm not. And I don't actually have like. There are lots of people who are not theists for whom evil is kind of the big trump card. It's the reason why they're not theists. Whereas for me, the stuff about good and evil is not particularly important when it comes to being a theist or being a naturalist, because I have a quite different reason for being a naturalist, which is a kind of all things considered. I think that naturalism is a slightly more economical theory than theism. It commits you to a little bit less, and there's no data that favours theism over naturalism. Most things turn out to be a draw. Theists and naturalists both have explanations for things, and they turn out to be kind of equally good as explanations, right? Considerations about evil play no role really in that. I mean, of course, I don't think that theists have a better explanation of the evil than naturalists do, but I don't think that a naturalist explanation of why there's evil is going to be worse, right? So I'm not kind of invested in the whole. Is there some knockdown argument, either a logical argument or an evidential argument that shows that theism is false? I'm inclined to think no, none of those arguments work. That's not where my naturalism comes from.
Yeah, last year you brought up the simplicity, the economy, I think is what you just called it, position of naturalism, and I know in the book you and Mark discussing Occam's razor and the beauty of simplicity. Introducing God into the equation to fix things seems to be mucking up the whole, making it much more complicated. But on the other hand, in the book you were talking about that in Richard Swinburne's book, The Existence of God, you talked about him. He makes a lot out of making the theistic position one of the simpler position. And he talked about 0, 1, and infinity, but I didn't follow that line of argument closely, but it was intriguing to me. So tell us what Richard was saying, and then shoot that down about why it doesn't make a simpler position.
So Swinburne thinks God's kind of as simple and ultimate explainer as anything could be, because all of the divine attributes are numbered by 1 or infinity, he thinks. So God's infinitely powerful, infinitely wise, infinitely good, right? There's no, it's not like there's some finite quantity of knowledge or power or wisdom that is appropriate to attribute to God. So Swinburne thinks he's got the simplest possible ultimate explainer, and that makes his view simpler. But the ultimate explainer doesn't explain anything on its own, right? If I tell you there's an omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good God, and I say, derive from that the value of the fine structure constant, right? You just look at me blankly and say, what? How could I possibly do that? There's got to be lots of other stuff in your theory that's fundamental in some sense, theoretically fundamental. You need a whole lot more posits in order to explain all of the data about the universe. I mean, you've got to end up at a minimum. So let's have a really kind of simple picture here. There's a bunch of laws, there's a bunch of initial conditions, and there's a bunch of things that happen by chance. So you have to know how all the chances play out. You have to know the initial conditions. You have to know the laws. Then you can explain everything else. But all of those things, the initial conditions, the laws, and the and how the chances play out, aren't explained by your ultimate explainer. They might be if your ultimate explainer wants things to be that way, for example, but that means that in your kind of ultimate explanations, you're appealing to God wants the value of the fine-tuning constant to be such and such. That's why it has the value that it does, right? If you now compare the theist and the naturalist in terms of their commitments, the naturalist is committed to, as kind of ultimate posits, all the initial conditions, all the laws, all of the ways that chances play out. But the theist will be too, right? It's just that they'll come by way of that's what God wants. God wants this, God wants that, God wants this other thing. And so the two theories look now as though they're on a par for their complexity in terms of all the posits they make, but the theist has God as an extra. And it doesn't matter how simple God is, right? Swinburne can have it that God's as simple as anything can be. It's still a theoretical cost. So the way I add this up, naturalism is slightly simpler. That's not the way that Swinburne sees it. But you can understand, I've explained why I think Swinburne's wrong. Of course, he thinks I'm wrong. You'd have to go and ask him for his reasons why he thinks that.
So you're going to say that because it's simpler, it's more likely to be true?
I'm not thinking about that. I'm thinking this is more a kind of in the domain of Occam's razor. When we're choosing between theories, there are two things we want. We want the theory to be as simple as possible, and we want it to explain as much as possible. We have to trade those two things off. And what we're doing when we're comparing theism and naturalism on all the relevant data is thinking about that trade-off in the two cases and arguing about which one of the theories makes the trade-off better. I've argued that naturalism's slightly simpler, and I've argued that there's no data that theism explains better, so naturalism wins. Not by much, but it wins, and that's enough. Right, that's the way I argue it. That's the way that I think about it.
Willem of Ockham was a Franciscan friar.
Indeed, he was. Yes, but his view about, and the way that I understand it, right? He says don't multiply entities beyond necessity. That's just a version of this claim, right? You only believe in as much stuff as you need to get the best explanation that you can of all the data, right? So he was talking about theory choice, and I just think he was right.
Graham, how do you decide as a philosopher? We were just along these lines of explanatory simplicity. Given that the universe doesn't seem to tell us what kind of metaphysics it prefers, it just seems like we're in the business of creating the kind of metaphysics that we would prefer to see the universe through. What determines, and this might fall in line with, you talked a little bit in the book about good arguments or arguments and being convinced. And I would imagine that something that has explanatory scope and power would be convincing. But how do you determine philosophically what the best explanation for something is, because I know the universe didn't tell us simplicity is the best
Yep.
explanation. So where does that standard come from? Is it just I would prefer a machine with fewer moving parts, or
So,
where does that come from?
so I mean, I can do this in two parts. So one thing, suppose that I've got a theory that explains everything, right? There's nothing I can't explain with my theory, but I haven't postulated that there are fairies at the bottom of my garden. And you say, add in the fairies. And I say, no, because I already can explain everything. They're not going to improve my theory. They're only going to make it worse, right? So there's, right. So that's the idea of simplicity. Things in your theory have to pay their way. There's no end to the gratuitous posits that you can make, right? You should cut them all out. So that's one side of the kind of what's driving Ockham. On the other side, there's this thought, the simplest theory I can think of is that there isn't anything at all, right? That's a great theory. Well, except that you can't explain anything. We have lots of data. There's lots of stuff that's happening, right? It's a disaster from that point of view. So it seems kind of obvious, right? And maybe at this point I'm just waving my hands, right? That these two things have to be traded off, right? A theory that says there's nothing is terrible. A theory that just has all of this stuff in it that clearly doesn't explain anything, there's no reason to load it in there, is also terrible, right? So what do? We want to put these two things together. We want to believe as much stuff as we need to in order to get the best explanation of all of the stuff that needs explaining. And that's just the position. That's just Ockham's position. Now, you may not be persuaded by that. If you're not, we'll have to find some very different terms in which to have the conversation if we want to have a conversation about which of us has got the better theory, right? But this kind of idea, which is fundamental to Bayesian theorization amongst other kinds, is just more or less universal, right? When it in discussions of theory choice. So it's not something that just kind of gets pulled out of the air.
Yeah, there's some substance to it, but it just seems like if you're predisposed to fairy gardens or garden fairies, and and maybe you have a theory that can explain how they contribute to the wider picture.
So sure, but that would be different if they did something. You're right. If they explained something, that would be fine. Then they'd be in. Right, but I'm not expecting to be able to convince any of you that the fairies at the bottom of my garden do anything. Right, I'm not going to expect to be able to persuade you to believe in them. Right, for precisely that reason. Right?
Well, they explain Shakespeare a little bit anyway. Midsummer Night's Dream. Maybe he had some, I don't know, gnomes from Paracelsus. Who knows? But it seems then that what we're trying to do is, we don't want to discard fairies. I'm just colloquially here. We want to try to maybe, how do we know, like in that example, like we should either discard them just because at the present we don't know, or do we investigate them to see if we can have some explanatory contribution coming from them in a sense?
So, I mean, in the case of fairies, of course, what belief in fairies was very widespread in the UK in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. And there was widespread investigation, and all of the so-called evidence was kind of determined under investigation to be completely fraudulent, right? So sure, you don't, if people say there is something, you investigate it, right? There are lots of people who believe in Yetis, right? Or some version, it's quite common. There are these kind of giant hominids. They're like 4 or 5 meters tall. And
if you're in Texas, it's a cooler.
Yeah.
We have Yeti coolers, and well, you probably have them in Australia too, but yeah.
right. So now we can investigate this. We can investigate it in two ways. We can actually when there are reports, we can try to get records of the presence, but we can also think about this in a kind of a priori way as well. There's a bunch of considerations. If there were Yetis, there'd have to be quite a lot of them because we need a breeding population. There would be DNA traces in their environment because creatures can't, move around in an environment without leaving lots of DNA traces and so on. The verdict of scientific investigation is very clear. There's no such things. We can be absolutely sure that there aren't, right? So of course you get these reports, you investigate them, but unless you turn up reasons to believe in them, you just reject them, right? Now you can say, well, surely you can't be so confident that you can rule out, and then you just lots of stuff that we don't know about yet. Of course, that's not the idea. The point is just we have no reason yet. The best theory that we can make, because we keep adjusting our theory on the fly, is one that says that there are, and now I just point you to physics, chemistry, biology, and so on for all the psychology, for all the stuff that there is. It could be like it's, you can entertain the thought that there's more stuff, and that's bound to be true because none of the sciences are completed yet. But so
well, there's that joke in physics where you only get to invoke the tooth fairy twice, and they've done it like 3 or 4 times now with all the stuff they're proposing. The causal stuff that they're proposing, they're as elusive as fairies to some degree. I mean, my use of fairies is analogous, of course, but there are some metaphysics going on in science that we can't track down.
So it's important to distinguish between the stuff that's established and the stuff that's speculative, right? So do we know yet that there's dark matter? Not sure that we do. There's some questions, right? But I'm no astrophysicist, so I'm not speaking with authority here, but I gather that it's still an open question whether there is dark matter or not. And so I'm quite happy to be agnostic on that question. When the physicists tell me, my physicist friends tell me the matter is settled, then I will believe in it or not, depending upon what the settled state of opinion turns out to be. And our situation is that there's all kinds of stuff that we don't like, that we won't know in our lifetimes, right? There's all kinds of stuff that we're going to go to the grave uncertain about.
Right.
And that will be true for subsequent generations too. But when you work out what to believe, you're going to coordinate on this. What you must, in my view, coordinate on is the kind of settled science. Right?
Gotcha.
And then you just have to have an open mind. Right.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you should believe in. So suppose you thought the investigation of Yetis was incomplete. That doesn't mean it'll be okay for you to believe that there are such things. The right thing then to do would be to just say, okay, I'm not 100% convinced that there aren't.
Right. Well, on the naturalism flip side, there's stuff like, consciousness is almost fairy-like. Some people even say it's illusory or it's an illusion or something like that. So do you see that there's an ephemeral nature to the things that we take for granted in our cognitive faculties that can't be explained, or you know what I'm saying?
So I think that the kind of hard problem of consciousness is greatly overrated. And I think we have consciousness. I think that consciousness has got something to do with some kind of neural functioning, and we just haven't yet figured out what that is. Right. So it's not that it's kind of ephemeral. It's just that so far we haven't been able to understand it. And maybe, some philosophers have thought we'll never be able to understand it. But I don't see that as a difficulty.
Do we have free will? Do we have free will?
So then it depends what you mean, right? Because there are people who want to understand free will in terms of the ability to have done otherwise in the very circumstances in which you were placed. So that's the kind of libertarian conception of free will. And then there are other people for whom free will is more a matter of control. It's of agent control. The things that you do are done by you, right? Now, the libertarian conception is incompatible with determinism. It's not clear that the control conception is incompatible with determinism. I don't believe in libertarian free will, but I definitely believe in control. So I think that free will would be compatible with determinism, but I'm not a determinist. I don't think the world's deterministic, right? But just to make that clear, it depends what you're asking about.
You say you're not a determinist?
Yeah, I'm not a determinist. I think quantum mechanics tells us that the world's got indeterminism in it.
Does that operate at the level of our brain cells?
Well, it certainly, so does it? I don't know, but it certainly can. So here's a little thing you can do. You can get yourself a Geiger counter. You can set it to the background rate. You can then use it as a quantum coin and go for a walk. Each time you come to an intersection, you ask your quantum coin, do I go left or right? It sends you left or right. An hour ago, nobody could predict your route, right? Because the quantum indeterminism just comes up to the macro level through your Geiger counter. So yes, whether our brains have mechanisms that feed off indeterminism in the way that a Geiger counter would, I'm not going to speculate about that. I doubt it, but certainly the world is indeterministic, and because what I do depends upon other stuff in the world, you can't predict what I'll be doing in a week's time, right? Because of quantum indeterminism, regardless of how our brains work.
I'm sorry, Graham. Could you repeat that example? I didn't follow you.
Okay, so this is something that you do in first year physics in prac. You get a little radioactive sample and you get a Geiger counter, and for every minute for 3 hours, it's incredibly boring. You read the Geiger counter, and then from that, after the 3 hours, so you've got 180 data points, there'll be a different number of clicks in the Geiger counter in each minute. What you're effectively measuring is kind of a background decay in the rate you start off by doing the background, then you get a sample, right? So you kind of working out what the half-life of the sample is. But the first bit, the background rate isn't zero. Your Geiger counter will be detecting decays all the time, right? And so suppose the background rate is 10. It won't happen that you get 10 clicks every minute. Sometimes you'll get 6, sometimes you'll get 14, right? But the average will be 10, because that's just kind of the way that the background works. Now I've got my Geiger counter, and I know what the background rate is, right? I know that it's 10. And so I can decide to go out on a walk. And what I'll do, each time I get to an intersection, I'll use my Geiger counter to measure for a minute, tell me to come up with a number. Sometimes it'll be a number bigger than 10. Sometimes it'll be 10. Sometimes it'll be a number less than 10. Right? And I can decide that I'm going to go left if the number's less than 10. I'm going to go right if it's 10 or more. And then I go out and I start walking. So I'm imagining it's a city like Melbourne, which is laid out on a grid. And so I just keep coming to intersections where I can go left, right. Or maybe I'll make it, if it's exactly 10, I'll go straight ahead, right? And now the route that I take is determined by the Geiger counter. And nobody can predict, because it's not determined which direction I'm going. Right, so that means that what was originally just this randomness in when things are decaying at a subatomic level, through my Geiger counter has been funneled up to the macro level. I'm now myself indeterministic in my movements, right? Because which way I go depends upon the readings in the Geiger counter, which is just sampling from the indeterminism at the quantum level. Does that make sense now?
Yeah, but I don't see how that ties into free will.
No, this was answering the question that I forget now who it might have been Ken asked me about whether the indeterminism at the quantum level spills up to the macro level. And my answer to that question is yes, right? I can tap into the indeterminism at the quantum level to make my own actions indeterministic. That's got nothing in particular to do with free will, according to me. I mean, some people think it does, because some people think that our brains kind of tap into the quantum indeterminacy. This is roughly the view of people like Roger Penrose. And so we are actually indeterministic because our brains tap into the indeterminism. I wasn't committing myself to that, but some people do.
Yeah, I think just to, by way of background, that most things at what they call the macro level, which is the scales that we normally live in, everything is determined. But according to quantum theory, if you go down to the minutest submicroscopic levels, we're talking about way below the atomic level, there can be true randomness. And so, and that can be elucidated through a Geiger counter. I guess you could kind of magnify the effect at the tiny quantum level up to the macro level through a Geiger counter. And so it's a thought experiment to say that, well, perhaps if you amplify that quantum level, that there could be true indeterminacy. But in either case, there's only two, according to Graham's worldview, there's only two ways that a person can make a decision. Either that decision is determined or it's random. But in neither case does it support the idea of libertarian free will. So he's not supporting the idea of libertarian free will.
So, except that there's so exactly, it doesn't support libertarian free will, but then there's this other dispute about whether free will has to be libertarian or whether it can be compatible. That's the kind of thing that's compatible with determinism and compatible with indeterminism as well. Because as you said, the standard view in physics is that lots of stuff is kind of deterministic. Maybe our control over our actions is deterministic, but nonetheless free. Right? So there are lots of people who've argued for positions like that. If, on the other hand, you insist that were there to be freedom, it would have to be libertarian, then no, I'm opposed to freedom in that sense.
So Phil had a comment that naturalism is self-defeating. That's a pretty big claim there, Phil. What do you think? Do you agree, Graham?
Given that I'm a naturalist, no, I don't think it's self-defeating, but I'm familiar with plenty of people who try to argue that it is. I think that what happens when typically, though we'll hear from Phil in a few seconds, I assume, that what happens is that people impute to naturalists beliefs that they don't actually hold. And that's how you get to the inconsistency.
What do you think, Phil? Does that answer your question?
Were you addressing
that is a long discussion. Much longer than 15 minutes. That's for sure.
Phil's trying to be good and stay on topic. I appreciate that.
And I'm trying not to. I'm trying to show restraint, because last time we had our book session, I didn't show much restraint. Of course, it was my book that we were talking about, so I think I have a little bit of an excuse. But my basic argument is that you cannot explain the existence of natural law on the basis of natural law, because nothing can create itself. So if natural law cannot explain its own existence, then the existence and origin of natural law must be supernatural by definition, because something is either natural or it's supernatural, one of the two. So if natural law cannot create itself, and you can't explain its existence on the basis of natural law, then the idea that natural law is all there is self-defeating in that sense. That's the summary of the argument. Now, you could get into the weeds and get into all sorts of details, and that would take quite a bit of time. So, it's really not very practical or feasible to try to evaluate that in any thorough or comprehensive way in a matter of a few minutes.
So maybe I can say one thing, which is that I agree 100% that nothing can explain itself. But then once you postulate God, you're going to need an explanation, and it can't be God. So there's got to be something else. So there's got to be some other option that's available here.
Why can't it be God?
Because nothing can explain itself, right? There's no the problem with having natural law not being able to explain itself is just an instance of a more general claim. Nothing can explain itself. Self-explanation, like try it out. You ask me why A, and I say A because A, and you look at me kind of strangely and think you didn't understand what I asked you for. I wanted an explanation, right? You didn't give me one.
What I'm actually saying is something slightly different. There's a kind of a nuanced difference there, and that is that when I say nothing can explain itself, what I mean is that you can't explain the existence of something based on itself. In other words, the existence of natural law cannot be explained by natural law, and so it's more of a matter of saying that nothing can actually create itself. Nothing can be its own cause. Nothing can cause itself to just simply appear out of nothing and just appear, and it just begin to exist out of nothing for no reason. And that problem doesn't exist with God, because the problem of something being the explanation of its own existence, or the problem of something creating itself, only applies to contingent reference. It doesn't apply to non-contingent reference. If God exists, then he is non-contingent, and if he's non-contingent, he doesn't have the problem of self-explanation or creation. He is not self-caused. He is not self-created. He is uncaused and uncreated because he's eternal, and he's an uncontingent necessary being. So there isn't this parity between natural law and God, the way that it's kind of being framed here. So that's kind of the high level way that I would address that.
So my kind of naturalist just disagrees at this point, though. If that actually the universe is necessary, right? So, and the laws too are necessary.
Necessary
so there's
and
no
eternal. The universe is necessary and eternal.
Not eternal, but the eternal bit isn't important for this. The important bit is the necessary bit. There's no self-creation or self-explanation going on here. The explanation of why the universe exists is because it must exist. The explanation of why the laws are as they are is because they must be. If you ask why they're necessary, that's explanations come to an end at that point. There's no explaining why things are necessary. We've reached the terminus of explanation at that point. Just as if you're a theist and you think God's necessary, and you say God exists necessarily, that explains why God exists. Someone who asks you, so why is it necessary that God exists? You're going to stop at that point, I assume.
So universes by definition are necessary. So thus, if there is a universe, it must be necessary.
By definition, I don't know if by definition is right, because I assume that God's not necessary by definition. That would rule out, for example, Swinburne's view on which God isn't necessary by definition. So that doesn't seem quite right. It's just that many people have a theory according to which God's necessary. And I have a theory according to which the universe is necessary, and I claim that there's parity here when it comes to questions about the explanation of existence. So this goes back quite a way. I first started writing about this about 15 years ago, maybe, and there are quite a few people, quite a few theists who kind of accept that I can say these things and they need to say something else in order to criticize my view. They can't criticize it on the grounds that somehow or other there's something that's inexplicable on my view, that is explicable on the theistic view.
So I'm on board with you there. What troubles me is, so you have this initial state that was necessary. How did it come about that something happened, though? There's matter and time and energy and things that go on afterwards. How did it go? How did that transition from a state where presumably nothing was going on to a point where, like the first mover argument, I guess you could prime mover.
Right. Okay. So what I'm thinking is that the evolution of state is necessary. So there has to be an evolution of state, and I'm thinking it's indeterministic. But how the state evolves depends upon, I mean, if you take the idea of laws seriously, it'll be the laws, but I'm more inclined to talk about the powers of the things that exist in the initial state rather than about the laws. I mean, it's kind of odd to think of laws as actually doing stuff, whereas the powers, right? So that's built in, right?
Okay, you're packing it into the
But what's packed in there isn't kind of all of history, because chances have to play out, right? What's packed in at the beginning is all the potentialities for every possible universe, right? That's what's packed in there, right? So the thing has some powers to expand and so on, right?
Sounds
that's kind of not very different from the theistic conception, where what's packed into God is the possibility of making all the possible universes, right?
What is causal in naturalism, Graham? What do you find ultimately to be packing that causal power or containing that causal power?
Okay, so that's easy to answer now. If you look around the world, you can see all kinds of causal things. I mean, there are kind of self-moving things, animals, there are plants, there are things that are not self-moving but have causal powers of resistance and so on. If you go back to the initial state, who knows, right? We don't have a physics for the initial state. So I assume that there are no particles in the initial state. I believe that the way that the stories about the very early history of the universe go is that there's a kind of plasma, not at the sort of around the period of inflation or just afterwards, and somehow or other particles first appear out of that plasma. But what's true in the very earliest part of the universe, no one knows. So I don't know what the powers are or what the things are that exist there, because that's a job of physics, right? No one can work that out from the armchair.
Fair enough.
But do you agree there was a beginning?
So that's slightly up in the air. I mean, my preference would be that there's a beginning and there's just one universe. But physicists currently argue about whether there's a multiverse. And if you think of that as the kind of all-consuming reality, then our universe begins as this little bubble in the multiverse, but the multiverse could go back. I mean, the kind of standard models of the multiverse tend to have an infinite past, right? So I'm going to be slightly cautious at this point. I'll just say it in a conditional way. Assuming that our universe is all there is, I think it has a beginning. Yeah, an initial state.
Even if there was a multiverse, that just pushes it back a step, right? Like,
not unless we have some reason to think that the multiverse has to have an origin, right? Like if you kind of project back from the expansion of the universe, it feels like you're heading back towards an original point. Now, you might think you can go back further than that, and some physical theories speculate that you can, right? That you can imagine that there are these two widgets coming in from infinity past that collide, and the universe appears from that, and that would then give you an infinite past. But that's super speculative to think that way. It will be kind of, the simplest version is going to be, there's this origin, right? To the universe. That seems to me to be the simplest view. So, and it's much easier to talk about that. So I'm quite happy to run with it, but I'm not 100% committed to it because physics isn't.
But
Well,
you'd still have to explain the widgets, right? Where the widgets.
Well, if they're coming in from infinity, there's a problem. It's not clear that there's a problem. Why is the widget like this at this point? Well, it was like that at a slightly earlier point. Why was it like that at that earlier point? Slightly earlier point, and right, it just goes back to infinity.
So
this is a question about the kind of, I mean, I don't like infinite regress. I don't think it's impossible. So again, there's just a little bit of credence, right? That I'll point
what's
that
the
way.
difference? What's the difference between an infinite widget and a fairy?
So these widgets, if there were such things, will be doing real explanatory work, right?
Are they in your garden? Are they
so
somebody's garden?
yeah, right.
Everyone.
So I agree, right? I mean, that's why, but that's all in the lap of the physicists, right? I'm not going to. And I've read a paper by a physicist, and widgets is my word. He had some mathematical formulas and some explanation, right? Which is completely beyond my pay grade, right? So I've just simplified the story.
All widgets are not created equally.
So
you can always ask
we
the fairy
replaced.
if you have any question about that.
We replaced the turtles with widgets. It's widgets all the way down. Thanks, Graham.
Well, it's just two. It's just two widgets coming from
just
infinity.
Two. Okay, just two.
That collide, and then the universe
That's
emerges
much simpler
from
than
it.
an infinite number of widgets.
Yeah, well,
I think
that's true.
It is. Yeah.
Yes. Well, let me say, Graham, thank you so much. I want to value your time on this. I want to ask you the same thing we asked Luke Barnes 2 weeks ago. Tell us what Friday's really like, since you're already there.
Yeah. What's tomorrow like for us?
Well, I don't know what it's like for you. For me, it was pretty. The meeting that I just went through was very grim. So I hope you're all going to have a better Friday.
We will count on that. Well, listen, thank you so much for your gracious giving of your time, and it was a delight. Thank you. We want to remind all of our members to if you're in North Texas, please come join me at my house in a couple of weeks at the watch party. I'll put up a Facebook event for that so you can RSVP. And then the first Thursday of October is going to be Bill's special book club, where we're going to help his shelf one way or the other. We're going to either collapse it the rest of the way or shore it up firmly. So, Bill, any last words before we let we let Graham go?
No, I mean, Graham, you had excellent points, and man, we really appreciate you being here. I mean, it really helps out. Thanks.
Last word of advice, Graham, for our atheists and our Christian members. Any wise advice for us?
Well, I don't know if it's wise, but I think it's great what you do. The most important thing is people talk to each other. And take each other seriously. You guys obviously do that, so I think that's.
Well, you guys made that point in the book too, and I appreciated that part of the book as well. And I think it's what we do is a little strange, definitely rare, and I'd like to see more of it, as you would too. Thanks so much for being part of it. We'll see you guys next month.
Thanks, Graham.
Okay, bye.